Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in Chapter 2 of the Economic Consequences of the Peace, Europe Before the War and the Fate of Economic Organization. Our mission in this deep dive is, I think, really sharp and critical. We have to understand John Maynard Keynes' depiction of pre-WWI Europe, not as some, nostalgic golden age,
Not at all.
but as a profoundly bizarre, anomalous, and, fundamentally fragile economic structure that was already cracking before the guns of August even fired.
It's so essential to grasp the context of creation for this book, for the economic consequences of the peace. Keynes wrote this incredibly quickly. He was driven by this real sense of urgency and, frankly, frustration.
Right.
He gets back to King's College in October 1919, and he's essentially delivering his autumn lectures directly from the proofs of the book as it's being printed.
Wow, so he's basically live testing his arguments on his students.
Exactly. And that urgency, that polemical fire, it just fuels the entire work.
And the immediate impact was just explosive. It went so far beyond what any typical academic work achieves.
Yeah.
It became a sensation almost overnight. Why? What was the core appeal that made it so fashionable?
It really tapped into a very specific intellectual mood. You have this educated elite, returning from the absolute trauma of war, and the book's power stemmed from this one core idea, that the world was being ruined not by some deliberate malice, not by deep-seated wickedness or some inescapable fate, but by sheer stupidity.
Stupidity.
Yes. Bad management, total incompetence, and a profound failure of imagination among the ruling class.
That's a really significant distinction, isn't it? Because if the tragedy was caused by malice, then the solution requires, moral purity or a political revolution.
Right.
But if it was caused by stupidity, the solution is much simpler. It just requires a change in management, presumably led by those who think they're, cleverer.
Exactly. And this critique resonated so deeply with the clever generation, Keynes's own intellectual circle at Bloomsbury. They were just intensely impatient with how badly society was being managed by the traditional older political class, the people they often called the sound men.
The establishment.
The establishment. The book frames the Great War and the Treaty of Versailles as this colossal managerial failure. It was proof for them that power had been vested in completely the wrong hands.
So his motivation wasn't necessarily this fiery passion for justice that you might expect. It was more of an intellectual intolerance for just bad governance.
Precisely, and his tone reflects that completely. The work is famous for its iconoclasm, its shocking, heavily ironic critique. It's a frontal attack on conventional morality.
And his background, his association with the Bloomsbury Group, that plays into it.
Oh, absolutely. It confirms he was writing, at least partly, for readers who shared those mocking, almost cynical values of figures like Lytton Strachey. They delighted in dismantling the old Victorian moral framework that the older generation clung to.
So Keynes saw himself as the clear-eyed intellectual, the one who could solve society's problems if only the sentimental or incompetent politicians would just get out of the way.
That's the mindset.
That sets the perfect stage for Chapter 2 then, because before you can criticize the management of the peace, you have to define exactly what priceless but fragile thing they mismanaged. So let's unpack that core idea of pre-war stability, which he so famously called the economic El Dorado.
That term, economic El Dorado, is so deliberately loaded. It's not just a description, it's an indictment. It suggests an almost mythical level of prosperity and ease, a sort of automaticity in global affairs.
Right.
For the comfortable, educated classes before 1914, the stability of global trade, of the currency with the gold standard, of financial relations, it all felt like a permanent fixture of the universe, a literal golden age.
They grew up expecting that permanence. The idea that a global, interconnected economy could just suddenly shatter is probably unthinkable to them.
Utterly unthinkable. And Keynes' genius in this chapter is how he just strips away that illusion. He argues right from the start that this apparent stability was actually anomalous, artificial, and precarious.
Those three words are key.
They're everything. The fact that this intense integrated system existed at all was, in his view, a historical fluke. It was this marvelous, intricate structure, but it was fundamentally unsustainable in the long run, and that meant it was easily destroyed by an external shock, like the war.
So if we accept that premise, that the system was anomalous and precarious, it changes everything. It means that even if the peace conference in Paris had been staffed by saints and geniuses, they were already dealing with an internally collapsing structure.
Yes. The rot had already set in.
So what were the specific cracks that Keynes identified, the ones that existed before 1914?
It's so crucial to understand this point. The war was the external shock, the big explosion. But the system was already decaying from within. Keynes points to two key internal threats to this so-called El Dorado. First, there's the mechanical, sort of structural threat. Europe's pull on the resources of the New World was already decreasing.
Let's dwell on that for a moment, that structural reliance. Why did Europe need such a strong pull on the New World? And what exactly are we talking about when we say New World in this context?
Okay, so we're talking about the densely populated, industrialized core of Europe. Think Britain, Germany, France, Italy. Their populations had just exploded in the 19th century, all driven by industrialization.
So you have huge cities, huge populations, far more than the land could support.
Exactly. This population density meant they could no longer feed themselves. It's that simple. They relied absolutely on vast, steady imports of grain, meat, raw materials coming from places like the United States, Canada, Australia, Argentina. Those are the New World resource economies.
In this reliance, this massive import bill, how is it paid for?
It was paid for in two fundamental ways. First, with industrial output, so manufactured goods. You send textiles, machines, whatever, overseas.
The workshop of the world.
The workshop of the world, exactly. And second, and this is crucial for Keynes's argument, through massive, ever-expanding foreign investments. Europe, but primarily Great Britain and France, owned colossal stakes in railways, in infrastructure, in industries all across the globe.
So they were landlords to the world, in a sense.
In a very real sense. And these investments generated a steady income, the interest, or tribute, as Keynes sometimes called it. And that income stream covered the perennial deficit in food and raw materials. It balanced the books.
So the whole system was this incredibly sophisticated mechanism that allowed Europe to effectively outsource its agricultural production. But if its financial pull, its ability to invest and get those returns weakened,
then the whole structure supporting its population becomes unsound.
So why was that pull weakening before 1914? What was changing?
Well, as those New World economies started to mature, they began demanding higher returns on their own products and resources. They also started to rely less on European capital for their own development.
They were building their own industrial base?
Precisely. The terms of trade were subtly shifting. It was becoming just a little bit harder for Europe to maintain its disproportionately high consumption levels simply by trading manufactured goods and cashing in on its historical financial claims. It was a slow, almost invisible geopolitical shift, but to an observer like Keynes, it was a clear sign of structural weakness.
Okay, so that's the mechanical threat. The plumbing of the system was getting old. Now for the second internal threat, which, as you noted, is far more subtle and really gets to the heart of Keynes' whole analysis.
Yes. The second threat was the profound instability of the psychological conditions underlying the entire social and economic order. This is where Keynes takes us beyond trade statistics and spreadsheets and into social philosophy, into the moral economy required for the system to even function.
So he's saying the magnificent structure wasn't built of concrete and steel. It was built of financial trust and, more importantly, psychological habit.
Absolutely. It was a magnificent, complex engine, for sure, but it was running on a fuel that was easily corrupted. And that fuel was the peculiar psychological consensus of the Edwardian and Victorian eras.
That feeling of permanence we talked about.
The permanence that the leaders in Paris expected was not a given. It was an illusion they had manufactured for themselves by adhering to a very specific moral code. But that code, Keynes argues, was fundamentally brittle. It was susceptible to external shocks, precisely because its foundation, human nature and its desires, was being rigidly controlled and suppressed by societal norms.
So if we see the pre-war world as inherently anomalous and fragile, it makes the war look less like the beginning of the end.
And more like the inevitable catalyst for a system that was already running on borrowed time.
And as you say, borrowed psychology.
And that dependence on specific psychological conditions, that takes us directly into what I think is the most compelling and frankly brilliant analysis in Chapter 2, the delicate psychology of accumulation.
Right. Keynes observed that for this whole arrangement to work, society needed a very specific and, you could say, peculiar psychology of the society. And this wasn't just about efficiency or innovation.
Yeah.
It was fundamentally about abstinence.
Correct. The engine of all this growth was capital accumulation. Europe needed to perpetually invest. It had to invest domestically to keep its own industrial machine running, and it had to invest internationally to maintain that pull on the New World we talked about.
Which means someone has to save, not spend.
A lot. And that meant the capitalist class, the people who controlled the vast majority of the wealth, had to resist the temptation of immediate, luxurious personal consumption. They had to be convinced to channel their massive fortunes back into saving and productive investment.
But, historical economics often just portrays saving as rational behavior. You save for a rainy day, you invest for a return. How did Keynes elevate this into a moral or psychological phenomenon?
He did it with one brilliant phrase. He argued that all of this prosperity depended on the vanity of abstinence to many.
The vanity of abstinence. Let's unpack that.
It's packed with meaning, isn't it? It suggests that this vast, necessary capital accumulation wasn't primarily driven by, a cold, purely economic logic. It was driven by social pressure, by moral justification, and perhaps even a form of personal pride or vanity attached to the virtue of being a responsible steward of wealth.
So the wealthy weren't necessarily selfless altruists.
Not at all.
But they were bound by this ethical framework that dictated they must reinvest. Viewing, saving, and continued expansion of their enterprises as a kind of moral duty, not just a way to get richer.
It was a generalized Puritan ethic, but applied to economics. The Victorian civilization achieved this tremendous material success and social stability, but as Keynes saw it, this came at a huge price. The price was cultural impoverishment and psychic strain. You had this constant tension between the ideals of civilized living, immediate aesthetic satisfaction, art, culture, pure enjoyment, and the grim, necessary needs of the economy, which demanded this relentless, joyless capital accumulation.
That sounds like an incredibly fragile moral bargain. You have a class with unprecedented power and the means for almost unlimited pleasure, and they're being told by their society and their culture that their highest duty is to forego that pleasure and perpetually reinvest, not even for themselves, but for some abstract future generation.
It was a highly unusual arrangement, to use Keynes' own phrase. It required the wealthy to live far, far below their means. I mean, think of the great industrialists or financiers of that era. They accumulated wealth on a scale that's almost unimaginable.
Right.
Yet their personal spending, while obviously large to us, was often just a fraction of their income, because the rest had to be plowed back into the global machine. This self-restraint was the brittle psychological foundation of global prosperity.
And it depended entirely on the continued, almost fervent belief in the necessity and the virtue of that self-restraint.
Yes, the moment that belief was challenged, if the promise of the stable, expanding future that justified all that perpetual saving was ever jeopardized, the entire foundation would just shatter.
And that is precisely what the war provided. The ultimate moment of shock and disclosure that completely undercut the vanity of abstinence.
It blew it to pieces.
So how did the war fundamentally alter the social psychology, not just of the capitalist class, but of the common person as well?
The war shook that delicate psychological foundation in two catastrophic ways. It disclosed two realities that, once seen, could not be unseen.
Okay.
First, the war disclosed the possibility of consumption to all. Think about it. When governments mobilized resources on an unprecedented scale for the war effort, they proved that massive, immediate consumption, even if it was directed towards destruction, was possible.
That's a fascinating point. Governments demonstrated that the immense productive capacity that had previously been funneled into future investment could, in fact, be immediately redirected to satisfy current needs or goals.
Even if those goals were wartime expenditures, yes. People saw it. They realized the potential for wealth distribution and the immediate use of resources actually existed. The underlying scarcity argument that was so often used to justify low wages and high savings suddenly looked very suspect.
Especially when society could suddenly afford to keep millions of men idle in trenches, fed, clothed, and supplied with munitions for 4 years.
Right. It proved that the limiting factor was often the organizational structure, not some absolute shortage of resources.
And that revelation must have been devastating to the moral authority of the pre-war system. It suggests that the sacrifices demanded of the working class and the restraint demanded of the capitalist class were based on a potentially false, or at least a highly malleable, premise of scarcity.
And that leads to the second disclosure, which was the undoing of the capitalist class's own moral commitment. The war demonstrated the vanity of abstinence to many.
Why?
Because the war replaced the certainty of the future with profound, absolute uncertainty.
When the future is uncertain, when you have rampant inflation, the threat of revolution, political chaos, or just the complete destruction to the old order, The entire calculation changes.
It changes drastically. The moral rule that demanded perpetual saving just vanished overnight. Why would you forego pleasure today for a future that might never arrive? Or a future where your savings might be wiped out by hyperinflation or punitive taxation or, the Bolsheviks?
The incentive for abstinence, the reward of a permanently secure, wealthier future, was just eliminated.
Gone. So the moneyed class, facing this uncertainty, naturally pivoted toward immediate consumption, luxury, and liquidity. Get your money out, spend it now.
So the psychological engine of the entire global economic system ran on this promise of future reward and stability. Once the war eliminated that sense of permanence, it eliminated the incentive for the very behavior saving and reinvestment that was required to keep the engine running.
The system became paralyzed from within.
It's the perfect illustration of how Keynes saw economic theory as just inextricably linked to psychology and sociology. The moment that psychological contract was voided by the reality of war and its aftermath, the economic system lost its internal ability to regenerate capital.
And this psychological destruction, this collapse of the will to save, it paved the way for the physical and structural destruction that truly brought the continent to its knees.
Which brings us to that shift. We go from the internal psychological collapse to the external physical shock of the conflict itself. The war acted as this catastrophic destroyer, fundamentally shattering the structural pillars of the economic El Dorado. Keynes was very clear about the immediate economic damage.
He identified three major destructions that, taken together, constituted a total collapse in Europe's ability to sustain its population. First, and perhaps most importantly, the wholesale destruction of Europe's economic organization.
And we're not just talking about factories being bombed here, are we?
Yeah.
What did the destruction of the organization actually entail?
It's so much more than that. This was the complex, interconnected system of exchange, of credit, of production flows, supply chains, transport, all the things that had evolved over a century of relative peace.
The software of the economy, not just the hardware.
Perfect analogy. Before the war, goods and capital flowed almost seamlessly across borders. It all relied on a vast, invisible network of commercial trust, established credit systems, and functioning railways and ports. The war shattered that infrastructure of trust and functionality. Credit lines between countries just broke down. Transport became a disorganized mess. The seamless specialization of industrial centers across the continent just stopped functioning.
It's the difference between a finely tuned Swiss watch and a pile of gears on a table. Even if all the gears themselves are intact, if they aren't assembled and working in perfect harmony, the watch tells no time.
And that disorganization was fatal to a continent that had specialized itself into extreme population density, which leads to the second major consequence, the loss of purchasing power. The war had largely destroyed Europe's stake in the New World.
And this goes right back to that financial pull we were discussing earlier. The war forced Europe to sell off its golden goose, its foreign investment.
Precisely. To finance the import of war material and food, since all your industrial production was focused on making weapons, countries like Britain had to liquidate huge swaths of their extensive foreign investments in the U.S. and South America, everywhere.
And that capital, that wealth, which once generated the income to cover Europe's food imports,
was simply gone. It had been burned up in the war. Europe, almost overnight, went from being the world's creditor to being a debtor continent. It lost its future claim on external resources. Its ability to pay for the necessities of life, especially food and raw materials, was decimated.
So just to recap, you're left with a shattered financial mechanism and a completely disorganized productive infrastructure. And when you combine that organizational failure with immense population density, you inevitably trigger one of the oldest economic horrors imaginable.
You release the Malthusian devil. It's one of Keynes's most powerful images. He stated that the result of the war's wholesale destruction of organization and the collapse of the psychological foundation was that the war had set free the Malthusian devil.
Let's ground this concept for a moment. Thomas Malthus, back in the 18th century, argued that population growth will always outrun food supply, leading to famine, disease, and societal collapse. So why was this devil contained or, asleep before 1914?
It was contained precisely by that anomalous organization we've been talking about. The devil had been asleep for a century, Keynes noted, because this complex global system allowed industrial Europe to sustain its massive, dense population.
It was a technological and financial fix for a biological problem.
Exactly. Through its industrial output and its foreign investments, Europe could import the sustenance it needed. Its population relied entirely on its ability to manufacture goods and send financial claims abroad to secure food. The system was a highly sophisticated structure designed specifically to bypass Malthus's constraints.
So the war didn't invent population density or scarcity. It simply destroyed the sophisticated mechanism that allowed Europe to ignore those realities.
That's the key. When the organization was destroyed, when Europe could neither manufacture competitive goods efficiently nor pay for its imports with investment income, that containment mechanism failed immediately. The population pressures, just the sheer number of mouths to feed, coupled with the inability to produce or pay for imports, they reasserted themselves violently. It was a crisis of shattered capacity against fixed, high population levels.
And Keynes noted exactly where the first, most catastrophic result of this rampage was observed.
He pointed straight to Russia. For Keynes, the chaos, the famine, and the subsequent revolution in Russia were not merely political or ideological movements at their core.
Right.
They were a direct, catastrophic economic consequence. Russia was the first test case. It proved that the failure of the pre-war economic organization to sustain its population once its delicate balance was broken leads straight to societal collapse and the return of pre-industrial horrors.
That really forces you, the learner, to reframe the Russian Revolution. It's not just a political event in isolation. It's an acute symptom of a much larger disease, the destruction of the global economic order. And if it happened in Russia,
It could happen across the entire continent.
which makes it a terrifying warning shot for the leaders who are gathering in Paris.
A warning shot which, as we'll see, they completely ignored. Which brings us to the core tragedy of the peace conference itself. The fatal misunderstanding by the leaders in Paris of the scale of this destruction and the fragility of the patient they were supposed to be treating.
The overriding lesson of Chapter 2, the one Keynes was desperately trying to convey, was that the pre-war stability was artificial and precarious. And the leaders in Paris, gathering in 1919, were just profoundly mistaken about the reality on the ground.
They failed to comprehend the inherent, almost magical fragility of the global economic system they had inherited. And, critically, they failed to grasp how easily and how completely the war had destroyed this system, releasing these catastrophic pressures like the Malthusian devil and the psychological paralysis of capital.
They were operating on a pre-1914 playbook in a post-1918 reality.
Completely.
And Keynes was there, of course. He was witnessing the proceedings before his famous disgusted resignation. He had a front row seat to this decision-making process. What was the human element like in that environment? What was the climate like in Paris?
Keynes's personal letters from that time provide this visceral and deeply cynical picture. He found the environment just corrosive. He described the atmosphere as that hellish place and characterized it by feverish, persistent, and boring gossip.
Not exactly an environment for clear long-term thinking.
Not at all. It was a world of diplomats and politicians focused intensely on small slights, on personal standing, on who was up and who was down.
That sounds utterly draining and so unproductive. It certainly doesn't sound conducive to grasping these huge, abstract economic realities like intricate global supply chains or the delicate psychology of capital accumulation.
It made rational decision-making impossible. I mean, while Keynes and the Treasury delegations were trying to deal with multi-billion-pound calculations and the very real threat of starvation across Central Europe, the political leaders were just mired in the short-term political demands of their home audiences and these petty internal squabbles over territorial boundaries. Keynes felt that the prevailing mood was one of smallness, cynicism, self-importance, and bored excitement.
Bored excitement, that's a damning phrase.
It isn't it? It implies they were too exhausted, too self-important, and too politically focused to comprehend that they were dealing with a deep structural crisis of civilization itself.
And that domestic political clamor, that need to satisfy the voters back home, led directly to the most destructive agenda point of the conference, the focus on political punishment over economic repair.
Exactly. Political leaders, and most notably Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, felt they had to prioritize vengeance to satisfy their constituents. Lloyd George had, during the election campaign, made these public promises that Germany would be charged the whole cost of the war. He even claimed he had expert committees that assured him Germany could pay.
Which brings us to that infamous quote attributed to Sir Eric Geddes that perfectly encapsulates the vengeful mindset that just overshadowed any rational thought.
The one about the lemon.
That Germany would be squeezed as a lemon is squeezed until the pip squeaked.
And that political slogan became economic policy. This thirst for political vengeance actively suppressed the rational economic analysis that was being produced by the financial experts right there in Paris. Keynes and the collective treasury view, which held that Germany could realistically pay only a tiny fraction of what the politicians were demanding, were largely ignored.
Despite his eventual resignation and his profound condemnation of the treaty, Keynes wasn't entirely a lone voice in the wilderness, was he? He did have significant support for a more moderate position on indemnities.
He did, and that's important to remember. The rational economic perspective wasn't absent, it was just overpowered. The U.S. Treasury delegation, for instance, often saw eye to eye with him on the unrealistic nature of the demands. Bonar Law, the conservative leader in Britain, was a quiet voice for moderation.
Jan Smuts.
And perhaps most importantly, Jan Christian Smuts, leading the South African delegation. He was a strong ally. He deeply admired Keynes' masterly memorandum on indemnities and the clear-eyed mathematics of the Treasury position.
So the data and the warnings were all present. They were backed by significant figures, but the political will was just absent, poisoned by populism and these very short-sighted goals. It was the intellectual divide in action.
Absolutely. The leaders pursued an agenda of political vengeance and totally unrealistic financial demands, rather than an economic agenda focused on the far more urgent task, restoring a global system whose life support had already been cut off.
The Peace Conference, in Keynes' damning assessment, was managing political perceptions of victory, not managing economic recovery.
And by failing to acknowledge the inherent fragility of the economic El Dorado they had inherited and the scale of the damage that had already been inflicted, they ensured its complete collapse and the full rampage of the Malthusian devil across the continent. This wasn't merely a political mistake. In Keynes's eyes, it was an act of civilizational stupidity.
The failure was total, because it mistook organizational collapse for mere political defeat.
Yes. They failed to grasp that the intricate network of credit, consumption, and financial trust was not something you could just turn on or off with the treaty signing. It was a living, breathing, fragile ecosystem that, once dead, would be incredibly difficult to resurrect.
That is such a powerful conclusion to Chapter 2. It forces us, the learner, to recognize that the greatest catastrophe of the post-war world wasn't the war itself, but the sheer failure of vision among the world's leaders in its aftermath. So to recap, we have unpacked Keynes' critical foundation from Chapter 2. The economic El Dorado was based on this incredibly precarious balance, both structural with its reliance on the New World and deeply psychological with the vanity of abstinence. The war destroyed both of those pillars simultaneously, releasing a Malthusian devil whose first catastrophic symptom was seen in Russia.
And the final provocative thought that Keynes leaves us with in this chapter is, I think, critical for any analysis of modern societies. The moral demands of a society, things like abstinence, self-restraint, perpetual saving for the future, are only sustainable as long as the underlying economic system appears permanent and intensely successful.
When that success falters or when the future just becomes uncertain, as the war proved it could, that social obligation evaporates instantly.
The required psychological contract is voided. And when that collective belief breaks, Keynes suggests, societies descend into an economic chaos that far surpasses a mere financial downturn. The organization itself collapses, and the consequences are brutal and, yes, Malthusian.
It raises a terrifying question for our own time, doesn't it? What happens to modern societies if their psychological conviction in continuous prosperity and guaranteed future returns is permanently shaken?
Keynes' analysis suggests the ensuing chaos is not merely recessionary, but existential.
Join us for Episode 3, where we move past the analysis of pre-war Europe and plunge directly into the heart of the matter. Keynes' famous damning judgment on the political leaders at the Peace Conference, detailed in Chapter 3, The Conference of Peace.